recently to work with MOCO has been a real pleasure. It's a long time since I was able to work side by side in partnership to look at some of the issues confronting Māori, and that was when I was at Victoria and we established student services for Māori and also for people with disabilities. So it's been very special. So it has been exciting. My journey with the SDGs began when I was with Volunteer Service Abroad, when I come back from London, where we had been in the Millennium Development Goals and involved in the Millennium Development Goals. And I'd just like to say, when you finally see that list of recommendations, some of you will say, as indeed our colleagues on the steering group have said, why are there so many? 5 will do. Now, as one of those people who's attempted to be one of the 5 on my particular issue, which was always sexual and reproductive health and gay rights, it's very hard to get in the top 5. In the Millennium Development Goals, George Bush talked to Kofi Annan on the 38th floor of the UN, and sexual and reproductive health and family planning disappeared from the MDGs that were announced the next day. If you're an NGO in this country, so now I work with rare disorders. Getting rare disorders, 400,000 people in New Zealand with rare disorders, into any dialogue, getting a meeting. I can't get a meeting. So that's why there are so many, because it gives them a chance to say, we're there, we're recognised. To say to a potential funder, look, here's a recommendation about the difference that we can make. And that is really exciting. So that's one of the reasons there are. What was going to be a report has turned into 3 reports. And you'll see that, in fact, this is the final draft. And I'm an ex-school teacher, so you can imagine, I don't like the fact that I know there are probably some typos and mistakes up there, but they'll all be sorted out while I'm in Kuala Lumpur in the next few days and the others are here. But in all seriousness, we thought, well, we've got to give some people a takeaway, and this will be it. We had a couple of thousand printed, and we hope they will go to schools, to libraries, because one of the findings from our work and from the survey is that the people, the 188 people who responded from organisations around the country, said that the awareness of the SDGs among people they knew was probably less than 1%. And I don't think that's going to surprise you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that survey, and my thanks to many of you in this room who completed it, and also my thanks to those of you in the room who wrote either a part of a report on a particular goal or the whole report. And thank you, and some of you completely ignored the instructions that they were going to be 750 words or 1,000. But in the end, we just thought, some of this is pure gold. You know, who would I be, for example, to criticise Cat Wallace's and say, sorry, Cat, you've got to take up 6 paragraphs, when she knows far more than I will ever know about her particular topic. So, just a very warm welcome and thank you to everyone involved. So what have we learned, apart from the fact that the Sustainable Development Goals are not well understood? And let's just remind ourselves that they're not like the Millennium Development Goals. They're not about rich countries helping poorer countries. They are universal. They are about the people in Kaikoi as much as they are about the people in Kiribati. And I think that's one reason that many governments have struggled with them. It's easier in some ways to be the generous donor than it is to actually grapple with the everyday problems here in New Zealand. And what this report will show you is there is some fantastic work going on. Some of it led by NGOs, some of it by government, some of it by business, and I hope we will see that more. Because the whole point of Goal 17 is multi-sectoral partnerships. Interestingly, the NGOs ranked that lowest. Now that's a real worry to me. And the reason for it is, very few of the NGOs have had a conversation with anyone in government about the Sustainable Development Goals. The only ones that have, there's a few of them here today, are the ones who work for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. Because of course our partners across the Pacific and elsewhere are hugely committed to the MDGs and to the SDGs. So 2030 Agenda and the SDGs. So what about New Zealand's role? I just want to touch on this quickly. I've been at the UN over many years and have felt incredibly proud to represent civil society in New York and at other meetings around the world. It has been a champion of human rights. It has been a champion for sustainability. It has been a champion for civil society. I watched a member of parliament in a meeting once in Aotearoa, and she just kept on saying that the declaration doesn't include civil society. And she said it 4 times in a meeting, and finally they got us in. So, what worries me is government signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals with 190 others. But there is no framework. There is no minister. And one of you sitting in this room, whom I can see now, I look at the ceiling, has said very clearly, representing many of us, there should be a minister, and the SDGs should sit within the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. Because New Zealand has always encouraged multilateralism. So why is it saying now, well, you go over there and play, and we'll do our own thing here? Not that we don't have plenty to address at home. We certainly do. But that seems to me strange, because Living Standards Framework, fine. Treasury has done a mapping of 5 pages to show how they fit, but it's not clear. And so one of the calls from us is, bring them together. Don't have them compete, but find ways to clearly link them. Because much that happens in the Living Standards Framework and the new wellbeing budget is health. So, what do NGOs in this country worry about most? What is the most important goal for them? Health. What's the second most important? Education. Helen Clark organised a global survey before the SDGs were completed. It's just 16 goals then, and given no targets and no indicators, much simpler. Around the world, people came in with the top 4, in different order, but the top 4 stayed the same. Health, education, jobs, and surprisingly perhaps for us, but not if we think of a few things recently in the paper, good governance. I'm not thinking so much as government in this case, I'm thinking about governance in terms of business in a particular case here. So that's really interesting. Who do the NGOs and civil society think are the most disadvantaged in New Zealand? I don't need to ask you that, and I don't need to tell you the answer. Because of years of neglect and racism, Māori were seen as those most in need of support. So I'm just going to touch very quickly before I hand over to Moko, we haven't had a lot of time really to organise ourselves and what we were going to do. But number 1 for the NGOs, health and wellbeing. Or they weren't all NGOs, in fact about 10 government departments got involved in the end too. Secondly, as I said, education. Then if we think about engagement with government, I really want to stress this. I left New Zealand in 2006 to go to London, and I came back, and my successor at BSA is here today. I came back in 2012 and went to BSA. I would say civil society in this country is more fragile than when I left. And what is their major problem? What do they identify here as the main issue? You'll guess that one too, funding. And in particular, short-term funding. And what happens is governments talk collaboration and they fund competition. All the time. So when we should work together, the only time I've seen Huye have 80 people in their meeting room when they had one was when Stats came to talk about the new data. We were all there to see if our issue, I was there to see if women's equality and gender equality were there. That's why we were there. We weren't there to say, let's work together. We were there, have we got a chance of getting money? It's on the list. Unfortunately, our list won't have quite the same impact, but never mind. So, if we think about engagement with government, then the number who said they had little or no engagement was basically 82%. I don't think that can be right. I think it's wrong. I think it's my writing. I'm sorry. People who know me won't be the least bit surprised because they send their notes to me. Sorry. Those who had some engagement, 37%. Little or no engagement was close to 13%. Sorry, that was my writing. And 40% said they didn't have regular engagement. And hardly anyone out of those NGOs had the SDGs mentioned at all. So that, I think, is particularly interesting. And that's not to say that government isn't doing some great things, great reviews, great policies, real movement in areas where we've been looking for movement for a long time. But the partnership is lacking. And that's what it's about. The private sector, civil society, government, local and central, working together for a more just and fair and sustainable world. Just a couple before I stop. The most marginalised group were identified first as Māori, secondly people with mental health. So the government is right on target there in terms of fitting with this particular. People with disabilities, third. And then I mentioned the issues before. Interestingly, climate change came in at number 4. And of the people who filled in the survey, around 37% had a policy on climate change. We have work to do. We really do, if that's all we are. So procurement, emissions, use of energy. How many NGOs, how many businesses are really tracking that? And New Zealanders' understanding of the SDGs, about 0.94%, thought it was very high, and we descended really from there. Should the government do more to encourage the SDGs? 95% said yes. Because, and this is where I'll stop, it's a global framework. And in a world where one country's emissions become another country's pollution, where we are joined not by peace and prosperity, but by chaos and conflict and climate change, which the people who drew up the SDGs, those people who sat, led by Prime Minister of Liberia and the President of Indonesia, they said when they did the first list, climate change has the power to prevent us from reaching any or all of those goals. And we have been too slow to see it. And this is what the SDGs are saying. So I think that's important to keep in our minds as well. So I'm going to hand over to my partner and colleague here, and thank you very much indeed for listening.
Tēnā tātou, nā kanohi hau, tēnā koutou, nā kanohi mohi ana tēnā koutou. He uru tāki no te tairawhiti no te tanga māhake, no te Aotearoa hoki, tōmuku mahasa hau, kia ora. So first I'd just like to say, so a bit of my background. I was the co-chair of the New Zealand Soil and Health Association, and we produced the Organic End magazine, and we also owned BioGrow. So getting involved with this report, it was really important for me to think about the whenua. And so if you talk to any Indigenous person, land, people cannot be separated. And so we're really looking at things like oranga whenua, oranga kai, oranga tangata. So if the land is healthy and our food is healthy, then our people are healthy. And so a lot of the SDG work, and to be honest, I hadn't really heard a lot about the SDGs before I got involved. Now I dream about them. And I see them in every single thing I read, and trying to convince people to apply them. And so a big part of the work that I felt I could bring to the table and that was important to me was looking at things like glyphosate in New Zealand and why we have this toxic chemical applied on our land, waterways, why are our waterways so polluted, looking at different types of farming models, sustainable farming models, reducing our dairying issues, and a lot of the people that I guess stalked or interviewed or phoned about this, and because it's a really big job, trying to represent your people, it's a huge task, and so you want to do a good job of it. And the overwhelming feedback was, it doesn't matter if the land is no good for people, for recreational. Maybe the mountains just need to be closed, because what's the point of skiing and tourism if all the rich people can have access to all these things, but you can't get your traditional kai from your mahina kāinga. You can't get food from your lakes, you can't get food from your rivers. And so that was the overwhelming issues that came to the table. Also, a lot of, everything, all the SDGs link back to treaty breaches. And that is the underwhelming, underwhelming kind of current of this. So you can't talk about any of the goals without relating back to treaty breaches. And so we've tried to include a lot of that through the report. I think a more daring approach is required to go into the future, and that is a different type of business model, and where people have to leave their kind of logos and their labels at the door and really put the goal in front of them, the kaupapa in front of them, and work out how we can do this together, which is not an easy thing to do, because when you talk about collaboration, it's, people are got border controls and also difficulty with funding, and it's quite a big thing to do to say let's actually just put that in front of us and move forward with that. So basically that's how I see, when I think of the SDGs, I think of the whenua, I think about people's health, the health of our land, the health of our people, and that's how that all relates for me. I'd just like everyone just to close your eyes for a little bit, just close your eyes for just a tiny little second. Please close your eyes. So sometimes when we, a different way of expressing ourselves with Māori is through sound, like vibrational energy. When we talk about the puri rehua, we talk about the moth, and we think about the fluttering of the moth. And if you listen really carefully, you should be able to hear that. So the point of that is it opens the gates to a higher energy, and it opens a different type of vibrational energy. And what we're trying to hope is that with the work that we've done with the SDGs, that's what we've tried to do. We've tried to open the pathway, open the door, and apply a different kind of conscious level for people to really think about what the SDGs mean and how we can apply them. Because what we do here as an Indigenous culture has an effect on another Indigenous culture on the other side of the world, and some of the effects of that are easily international, and that's not polite, and it's not tikanga, and it's not a nice thing to do. So kia ora, thank you for that. Aha ko he tini ngā whetū ki te rangi, he nunui hoki ki te whenua, so as many stars there are in the sky, there's just as many on the land. And Jill, you're wonderful, and on behalf of Kura Year, we'd just like to thank you for your work, and
thank you so
much.
much.
Thank you for giving up to Anne Rain, thank you for looking after her and feeding her for us so that we can do this great work. So